I wrote no bridge in my ration ledger, and my pencil snapped like it agreed with the river. Roy's hands were raw from pulling rope, but the town kept asking for one more crossing. When the line sawed a deep gouge into our pine, I felt how close a single strand can come to taking a boy. I tightened the wrap and held him low on the raft, listening to the rope hum under load. And the water kept moving, as if it had not heard a single plea. April of 1884, Washington Territory. Near the riverside town of Cedar Ford, where the valley stayed green, but the river stayed loud. Spring melt had come early. Rain came after it. The nights still held a bite, and the mornings smelled of wet cedar and cold ash. Our cabin sat on a low bench above the water. A short walk behind it, tucked into the bank, was a root cellar we had lived out of more than once. If the river cut us off, we would lose more than flour and lamp oil. A sick child would go without medicine, and Roy and I would be stranded with no safe way to reach town. My name was Tamsin Hale. I was 68 years old, and my hands had long since learned to do work that did not wait for help. Roy was 11, thin in the shoulders, quick in the eyes, and mine to raise. His mother had left Cedar Ford with a traveling crew the year before. His father did not follow. A fever took him through the last winter, slow as a candle burning down, and then sudden at the end. So the boy stayed. So did I, caretaker, builder, provider, and the one who had to decide what we could risk. In the first week of April, I had 9 days of flour if I kept it tight, 2 jars of dried apples, and a small sack of beans with a tag that read H. Baker, Cedar Ford Store, in faded ink, 3 candles, and a half tin of kerosene that I guarded like coin. On the inside of our door frame, I still had the old winter snow mark cut with a knife. It sat there like a memory in wood. And that morning, I saw the river had nearly climbed to the same height, only outside. Roy noticed first. He came in from checking the hen box, water running off his cap. He pointed with a finger that still looked boyish in spite of calluses. "The bridge," he said. "It's missing boards." I pulled on my shawl and walked down through wet grass and alder. The air was full of the river's voice, deeper than it had been 3 days earlier. The Cedar Ford footbridge had been built from timbers sunk into the banks and a deck of planks nailed across. It was not a proud thing. It was only a promise, and a promise fails quickest in spring. One whole run of deck boards was gone. A stringer beam had shifted. Downstream, a length of timber spun in the current like a slow, dark fish. That was the first signal that could be shown plain as day. No guessing. No arguing. The river had taken what it wanted. By midday, the rain sharpened. The water went from brown to the color of stirred coffee, thick with silt. The current moved with an ugly steadiness that made the hair rise on my forearms. I kept my voice even for Roy. Panic is a kind of fire. It burns your thinking first. We went back up to the cabin. I pulled the ration ledger off its nail by the stove, the paper soft at the corners from handling. In pencil, I wrote a new line. April 6, river up, no bridge, flour, 8 days, if half cup morning, half cup night. Roy watched me write it. His eyes went to the numbers like they were a fence. He said, "Can't we just wait?" Waiting is fine when waiting is safe. Waiting is poison when the world is moving under you. That afternoon, before sundown, we heard a knock. Not at the door, at the window, soft and tired. It was Lisa Dunn from downriver. Her hair was braided but wet through, and her hands shook like she had been holding herself together by force. Her little girl, Mabel, lay in her arms. The child's cheeks were red, and her breath made a thin whistle. "Doc Harlan's in town," Lisa said, swallowing hard. "I can't get her across. She's been coughing since after midnight. She's hot as a stove brick." I went to the bed, laid the back of my hand against Mabel's forehead, then my own. The heat was not the same. This was not a simple chill. Roy stood close, quiet. He knew sickness. He had watched his father slip away in a room that smelled of boiled pine needles and fear. I said, "We'll do what we can." The words came out calm because I did not let them come out any other way. That night, the rain kept tapping the roof like fingers asking to be let in. Roy and I ate bean broth and a thin bannock, and I made him drink warm water with a pinch of salt. After midnight, I wrote another note, not in the ledger, but on a scrap. Stove, draft week, check flu at first light. I pinned it beside the lamp, because a cold, damp cabin makes lungs fail faster. Before dawn, I listened to the river. You learn a river by its sound. When it changes tone, it is changing mind. At first light, when I stepped outside and saw driftwood snagged in the willow, clump near our low bank, fresh, not there the night before. Roy came out with his coat buttoned wrong. He tried to fix it without looking down, the way boys do when they want to seem older. I said, "Not the bridge today." He opened his mouth, then shut it. We went to the root cellar instead. It was dug into the bank, lined with split boards and clay packed tight. We had a low door that latched from the inside. In hard weather, it held steady warmth, and in spring floods, it could be a refuge. I took inventory the way I always did. A tagged flour sack, half used, lay folded and tied. 2 crocks of pickled turnip, a jar of rendered tallow, a bundle of dried nettle leaves for tea. Roy's boots had a patch on the right toe. I kept a patch record on a strip of cloth, stitch counts, written small in pencil, because thread was dear. Boot patch number 3, 18 stitches, April 2nd. I showed it to Roy once, not for pride, but so he would understand the cost of small things. By mid-morning, the first true consequence came. The cabin floor near the door darkened, not from dirt, from water pushing up through the packed earth beneath. It was not yet a flood inside. It was a warning, a slow seep that told me the river had begun to press. Lysa came again near noon, eyes wide. "Mabel won't drink," she said. "She won't stop shivering, and she's hot at the same time." I thought of Doc Harlan's shelf of bottles. Camphor, laudanum, mustard powder. Maybe something stronger if he had it. We needed medicine. We needed it soon. And we needed it without drowning a boy. And I walked downriver with Roy to where the bank bent, and a tall pine stood above the water. The pine had roots that gripped the earth like knuckles. I stood there and stared. Roy said nothing. He was learning the way a person learns when they do not interrupt. The bridge was gone as a route, but a line could be a route if you could hold it. A rope could speak to the river in a language it understood. I said, "We're going to make a ferry." Roy blinked, and his lips parted. "A boat?" he asked. "A raft," I said. "A pull ferry. Simple. No fancy talk. A line from bank to bank, and a platform that rides the line." He looked at the river like it was a wall. Then he looked at me like I had said we could walk through stone. In Cedar Ford, there were men who talked loud and did little. There were also men who worked hard and still believed an old woman should sit down and wait. So I did not go ask. I went to build. We had hides hanging under the shed roof, salted from a deer Roy had brought down in late winter. Not a proud kill, a necessary one. Rawhide is honest. It does not pretend to be soft. It is tough, and when it dries, it holds. I cut the hide into long strips with my knife. Roy held the corners, and his hands were careful because he knew my blade did not forgive. We soaked the strips in a trough of river water mixed with a handful of ash. Then we twisted them, 3 strands at a time, the way you twist grief into something you can live with. I used our old hemp rope, too, splicing rawhide around it to give it backbone where hemp might fray. The smell was sharp, animal and wet, mixed with smoke from our stove. Every 6 or 7 short lines of work, I gave Roy one medium line of instruction. Not a lecture, a direction that moved us forward. Keep the twist even, I told him. Uneven twist makes weak spots, and weak spots are where a river finds you. Near 3 in the afternoon, clouds broke for a moment. Light hit the water and made it look like hammered pewter. It was beautiful in the way danger sometimes is. We dragged driftwood logs up from the snag line. Roy slipped once, and I caught his sleeve. The water licked at his boot, and I felt my stomach tighten. I said, "Back." He stepped away, cheeks pale. We built the raft on the high side of the bank. 3 stout logs, 2 cross pieces, a deck of salvaged boards we pried from the old footbridge approach, and we lashed it with rope and rawhide until the knots were fat and sure. By 3:30, Roy's fingers were red. He kept flexing them. I saw the first blister forming. I told him, "Hands are tools, too. You break them, you cannot replace them." He nodded, and for once he did not argue. The next consequence, beat, came fast. When we first tried to throw the line across, the wind caught it and slapped it down into the river. The current grabbed it like it had teeth. The line jerked. Roy yelped. I dug my heels into mud and hauled, arms trembling. The river pulled back. It always pulls back. I wrapped the rope around the pine's trunk, twice, then 3 times. The bark was rough. I could feel it grind beneath the line. That was when the proof detail made itself. Under load, the rope began to saw. Not fast, steady, and a thin groove forming in the pine's bark, and then into the pale wood beneath. I leaned close and saw the gouge mark begin, clean as a chisel cut. I said, "See that?" Roy stared. He swallowed. "That's the river writing on our tree," I told him, "and it does not write gentle." We needed an anchor on the far bank. We could not swim it, not in this water, not in April. So we used what we had. A throwing stone tied to a lighter cord, and then that cord to the heavier line. I chose a smooth rock, heavy enough to carry, and Roy watched me tie, because a knot is a promise you make with your own hands. At first light the next day, the rain eased to a mist. The river was still wild, but the air was quieter. We took the stone to the highest point of the bank opposite the pine, where the current bent closer. From there, if the wind held, and we could go. Roy asked, "What if it doesn't reach?" I said. Then we cast again. No shame in trying twice, only shame in pretending once was enough. He stood back. I swung the stone in a slow circle. My shoulders complained, and I ignored them. Then I let it fly. It arced out, cord hissing, and fell short. It slapped the water and vanished, and the cord went taut and tore from my hand. Roy's eyes widened. I held up my palm, calm. "We lost a stone," I said. "We did not lose ourselves." We took another rock. We tried again. This time, the wind shifted at the right moment. The stone landed on the far bank with a dull thud. The cord lay there like a pale snake. Roy let out a breath he had been holding. We waited. We watched. No one came to pick it up. The far bank was empty, trees dripping, the town beyond out of sight. So we did the next hard thing. We walked upriver to where the current narrowed against a gravel bar, and we shouted until our throats hurt. By mid-morning, a figure appeared on the far side. It was Ezra Pike, a man from town who had always kept his hat low around women with opinions. He cupped his hands and yelled, "What foolishness is this?" His voice carried over the water like thrown stones. I yelled back, "Pick up the cord and tie it to that alder." "Then stand back." He laughed, a short sound. "Old Tamsin thinks she's a bridge," he called. Roy's jaw tightened. I put a hand on his shoulder, not to stop him, to steady him. Ezra picked up the cord anyway, because even proud men can be curious. He tied it, sloppy at first. I shouted again, and he tied it tighter, because even proud men can be corrected when the river is listening. But we pulled the cord. We pulled the heavier line after it, hand over hand, until the rope ran from our pine to the alder on the far bank like a drawn bowstring. The consequence beat showed itself at once. The rope dipped under its own weight. The current pushed it down, trying to drown the line. I said, "We need it higher." Roy looked around. His eyes landed on the shed roof beam we had dragged down earlier. We propped the line with a forked pole, lifting it at our bank, giving it a bit of height. On the far bank, Ezra did the same with a sapling, though he grumbled while doing it. By midday, the line held steady enough for a first test. Not safe. Not yet. But speaking, I wrote in the ration ledger again. April 7. Line set. Test Ferry before night. The pencil tip snapped once, and I sharpened it with my knife, and Lisa came with Mabel wrapped tight. The child's breathing was faster. A thin whine came with each inhale. Roy looked at Mabel, and then at the river. His fear had a shape now, not for himself, for someone smaller. I said, "We will cross with weight first. A sack of stones. If the line fails, we lose stone, not boy." Roy nodded fast. He liked rules. Rules make the world smaller. We loaded a sack with river stones. We tied it to the raft. Then we pushed the raft into the water on our side, keeping it tethered. The current slapped it hard. The raft bucked. The line hummed. The pine's gouge deepened, a pale stripe showing where bark had been stripped. Roy whispered, "It's cutting." "It is," I said. "So we watch it. We listen, and we add what we must." We pulled the raft along the line, hand over hand. It moved slow, but it moved, and the sack reached the far bank, bumping the gravel. Ezra grabbed it and hauled it out. His face had changed, not softer, but less amused. He shouted, "It works." I did not smile. Working once is not working. Working twice is a beginning. Near sundown, the wind turned colder. A thin ice crust formed on puddles in the grass. April can do that, even when the day smells of wet earth. That night, we slept in the root cellar. Not from fear alone, from sense. The cabin floor had grown darker near the door. If the river rose again, we would wake with wet blankets, and wet blankets can kill. We carried bedding down. We moved the flour and the kerosene and the ledger. Roy brought his patched boots, cradling them like they were a pet. After midnight, the rain came again, harder. We could hear it striking the ground above the cellar, like drums, Roy asked, quiet in the dark. "Grandma, will it take the cabin?" I let the question sit. Silence is a kind of answer too, but a child needs more. "It might take boards," I said. "It might take the porch. It might take things we can replace. It won't take you while I'm still breathing." Before dawn, I woke to a sound that was not rain. A crack. Then another. A tree somewhere down bank was giving up. The earth was loosening under it. At first light, we climbed out. Mist hung low. The river had risen again, and it ran fast enough to make the far bank blur. The bridge's last upright timber leaned like a man too tired to stand. Then it went, folding into the water and vanishing. Roy stared, mouth open. I watched his face and saw something settle into him. The bridge was gone. So the ferry was not a choice now. It was the only path, and by mid-morning, Lisa's husband, Tom Dunn, came, looking like he had not slept. He held a trade chit in his fist, crumpled and damp. "H. Baker won't let me take medicine on credit," he said. He said cash or nothing, and he knows we can't cross. He's waiting us out. I took the chit. Ink bled, but I could still read the store mark. That was another proof detail, and it sat there like a little piece of evidence. A man's refusal, stamped on paper. Roy said, "That's wrong." "It is," I said, "and wrong things don't fix themselves." We decided then we would cross, not with a sack of stones, with a boy and an old woman and a child who needed help. I set rules out loud, rules calm hands. "Roy stays low," I told him. "No standing, no leaning, hands inside rope. We go slow. If I say stop, you stop." He nodded so hard his cap slipped. He pushed it back with shaking fingers. We wrapped Mabel in blankets, then in oilcloth, then in another blanket. Lysa kissed her daughter's forehead once, eyes shining, then handed her over like she was handing over her heart. Roy climbed onto the raft first, careful. I stepped on after, knees stiff, and sat low. The rope was wet. It felt alive under my hands. The pine's gouge looked deeper, and the rope fibers at that point were roughened. I looked at the gouge and made a decision. I took a strip of scrap leather and wrapped it around the pine where the rope sawed. Not to stop the cut, to slow it, to give bark a chance. By midday, the ferry began its first true crossing. The current shoved at the raft's side. Water slapped up and soaked the lower logs. Roy's eyes never left the far bank. He pulled hand over hand, small muscles straining. I pulled too, my arms burning. I did not tell him my shoulders hurt. He had his own hurt to carry. Halfway across, the rope shuddered. A knot we had made near the raft creaked. Roy froze. His hands stopped. I said, "Breathe." One word, not a speech, just a foothold. He breathed. He pulled again. The raft moved. That was the next visible consequence beat. Fear. Pause. Then movement again. Chosen. We reached the far bank with the raft scraping gravel. Ezra Pike was there, and 2 other men behind him, faces tight. Ezra grabbed the raft and steadied it. He looked at Roy's white knuckles, then at me. "You're out of your mind," he said, but his voice held no laughter now. I said, "Fetch Doc Harlan." He hesitated. A man likes to be asked. He does not like to be told. So I gave him one medium line. Firm. "If you want to keep your pride, keep it." If you want to keep a child breathing, move. He moved. By mid-afternoon, we stood outside the Cedar Ford store. H. Baker came to the door, wiping his hands on his apron like he was too clean for our kind of trouble. His eyes went to my boots, then to Roy, then to the wrapped child in my arms. His mouth tightened. "You crossed?" he said, as if it offended him. I said, "Yes." "And we'll cross again." He frowned. "That line of yours is dangerous." "It is," I said. "So is withholding medicine to make a point." Doc Harlan arrived, coat flapping, hair damp. He listened to Mabel's chest with a brass tube and his ear, face serious. "She needs something to break the fever," he said, "and warmth. And quiet." He pulled a small bottle from his bag, a label in his own hand. I did not read it out loud, because names can sound too sure. I only watched his carefulness. He gave Lisa instructions, then looked at me. "You've built a ferry," he said. I answered, "I built a chance." He nodded once, as if that was enough. At the store, H. Baker finally handed over a sack of flour and a small tin of lamp oil. He wrote a note, not a gift, a record. He tore it off and pressed it into my palm. I looked down. April 8. 1 sack flour, 1 tin oil, owed. His mark beneath. Another proof detail. A trade note that could be shown on screen, like a small confession. Outside, Ezra Pike said, low so only I could hear, "The sheriff's been asking about your line. He says you can't run a crossing without permission." I felt a tiredness settle in my bones, not from work, from people. "Tell the sheriff," I said. "He can come talk to the river." Ezra almost smiled. Almost. Near sundown, we loaded the raft with medicine, flour, lamp oil, and a small bundle of dried beef from Doc Harlan's wife, pressed into my hand without a word. Roy climbed on with the supplies. He kept his eyes down now, focused on task. He had crossed once. He had become someone who could cross again. The river had not gentled, but Roy's hands had learned its language. We pulled away from the bank. The rope hummed. The pine's gouge deepened another sliver. Halfway back, the wind rose. A gust hit the raft's side and turned it slightly, making the current push harder. Roy leaned without meaning to. Water surged up, cold, slapping his boot. My heart jumped, sharp as a knife. I reached and hooked my arm around his waist, pulling him back down. "Low," I said. One word again. A rule. He nodded, face pale, and kept pulling. We reached our bank. Tom Dunn ran down, eyes wide, and took the medicine as if it was gold. Lysa took Mabel and held her close, crying without noise, because she had no breath left for sound. That night, before midnight, I made another note beside the lamp. Check pine gouge, wrap again. I added a time cue under it, plain and steady. Near midnight. Because memory lies. Paper tells. In the root cellar, Roy asked, "Will the rope last?" His voice was small, and that made it serious. "It will last if we help it," I said, and if we do not ask it to carry more than it can." The next day brought a different kind of trouble. Not water. People. By mid-morning, 3 men from town came to our bank. The sheriff was one of them, coat buttoned, hat brim dripping. He looked at the line like it was an insult. Then his eyes moved to me. "Tamsin Hale," he said. "You've made yourself a ferry." "I made myself a way," I replied. He said, "You can't run a public crossing. There are rules." Roy stood behind me, fists clenched. I could feel his anger like heat. I kept my voice mild. "Rules don't carry medicine. Rules don't keep a child breathing." The sheriff's jaw tightened. H. Baker stood behind him, hands in his apron, watching. Baker said, "It's dangerous. If someone dies, who pays?" He looked at me like the answer was already written, and I answered with one medium line, slow enough to land. "If you want it closed, you're welcome to stand here and tell the Dunns why. And you can tell the next family too." The sheriff glanced toward the downriver bend, where smoke from small cabins rose thin. He knew names. He knew faces. He knew what would happen if he made a decision that looked clean on paper, but ugly in life. He said, "You'll charge a penny a crossing. Record it. Keep order." I almost laughed, but I did not. A penny was not the point. Control was. I said, "I'll keep a record. I won't take from those who can't pay, and I won't stop someone crossing for pride." Baker opened his mouth. The sheriff lifted a hand, stopping him. "Fine," the sheriff said, "but if your line snaps, don't come crying to the county." "I won't," I said. After he left, Roy spat in the mud. Then he looked at me, guilty. I said, "Spit doesn't mend rope. Come help me wrap the pine." We wrapped the trunk again, this time with a strip of old canvas and a layer of tallow rubbed on top to make the rope slide smoother. The gouge was deeper now, a clear, pale groove you could put a finger into. Roy traced it once. Careful. "It's like a saw," he whispered. "It is," I said. and that's why we watch it. By midday, the first neighbor came asking to cross, not for medicine, for salt. Then another, for seed potatoes. Then a man with a sack of mail letters. He wanted to get to the far side. Each crossing brought its own visible consequence. Wet hands, rope burn, new wear on the line, a knot that needed tightening, a log on the raft that shifted under load. Every 40 or so lines of life, and the river demanded we show what it did. Near 3 in the afternoon, a woman from the far bank arrived at the line, shouting. Her husband had tried to wade at a shallow straw upriver. The current took him off his feet. He clung to a snag, arms wrapped tight, face the color of ash. Roy looked at me, terrified. I looked at the river, calculating. We could not go into that current, but we could send the raft along the line with another rope trailing, if we kept weight low. I tied a second line to the raft, a lighter cord coiled neat. I told Roy, "You pull steady. Do not jerk. Jerk snaps fibers." We sent the raft out, empty of people, trailing the cord. The man on the snag reached for it, hands shaking. He caught the cord and looped it around his wrist. Then we pulled, not dragging him through water, but giving him something to hold while he worked his way along the snag to the bank. It took time. It took patience. It took Roy's small hands learning to keep a steady pull. By late afternoon, the man crawled onto the far bank, soaked through, coughing, alive. People on that side cheered. Not loud, not like a show, more like a breath released. That evening, Roy sat on the root cellar step and stared at his hands. Blisters had opened. Skin was raw in places. I warmed water and made a paste of tallow and ash. I rubbed it on his palms, slow. He said, "They'll think you're theirs now." His voice carried that new bitterness boys get when they see adults as complicated. I answered, "I'm not theirs. I'm yours. And I'm mine." Before dawn the next morning, a thin snow fell, not deep, and just enough to dust the alder branches and make the world look quiet and deceiving. The river did not care. It ran just the same. At first light, I checked the ledger. I wrote the crossings like the sheriff demanded, but I wrote more. I wrote where. I wrote the river's mood. April 10, 7 crosses, rope fraying at pine, gouge deeper, wrap again. The pencil made a faint squeak on paper. Roy brought me his boot patch strip. He pointed to the last entry. "Add 1, he said. He had patched his own boot that night, clumsy but determined. I looked at the stitches. They were uneven. They held. I wrote, boot patch number 4, 23 stitches, April 9th. Another proof detail, small and plain, but real in the way work is real. By midday, we heard shouting from town. It carried over the water, broken by the river's roar, and a wagon had tried to reach the old bridge site from upriver. The road was mud, and the wagon slid. A horse went down. No one died, but the road was blocked. That was the turning point that reached beyond our own cabin. Cedar Ford was not just cut in two. It was cut from its own supplies. H. Baker came to the bank himself near 3 o'clock. His boots were clean for a man who sold flour. He stood and stared at the line. Then he looked at the far bank and the near bank, like a man measuring his losses. He said, "We need to get goods across. Town's running short." I kept my face. Still. Roy stood close, silent. Baker added, softer, "People are getting restless." As if it was weather, not his own doing. I said, "This line can carry small loads. Not wagons, not pride." His cheeks flushed, and he looked past me to the cabin and the root cellar door. "You'll do it," he said, as if ordering. "Name your fee." I let the words hang. Then I gave him one medium line that moved the world forward. You can ask. You cannot demand. Not from a woman who has already decided what she will risk. His mouth tightened. For a moment, I thought he would threaten. And he did, in the way men threaten when they cannot swing an axe at the problem. He said, "The county could take that bank for a public crossing. Eminent need." He mangled the words, but he meant them. Roy's breath hitched. I felt him tremble. I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at Roy, and I spoke steady. "Go check the wrap on the pine. Count the turns. Tell me if the fray is worse." Roy moved, grateful for task, and his hands knew what to do, even when his heart did not. I faced Baker again. "The county can take land," I said, "but it can't make a rope stronger by decree." He stared. Then his shoulders sank the smallest amount. "Please," he said. The word scraped him on the way out. "We need to get flour and salt over. People are asking. They're asking loud." There it was. The town begging, not with humility at first, but with necessity. I said, "Bring sacks, not barrels. Bring men who can pull, not men who can talk. And you'll help me reinforce the line, because if it snaps, you'll have blood on your hands too." He nodded, quick, as if agreeing would erase his earlier cruelty. By midday the next day, the bank was crowded. Not a mob. A line of people holding sacks, bundles, and small children by the hand. Some faces looked ashamed, or some looked stubborn. Some looked simply tired. Ezra Pike stood among them, and he met my eyes. He did not grin. He gave a short nod that felt like respect. We added a second pine on our bank as a brace, wrapping the line around both, spreading load. On the far bank, they found a thicker alder and backed it with a stump wedge. Roy watched every knot. He began to correct grown men, quietly. "Not like that," he said once, voice calm. "Loop it under, then back." A man bristled. Then he did it Roy's way, because Roy's way held. The next consequence, beat, came when we tried the first supply crossing under full load. 2 sacks of flour, 1 sack of salt, a small crate of bottles. The raft sat lower. Water lapped the deck. The rope groaned at the pine. The gouge mark deepened another measure, and the protective wrap began to shift, and Roy whispered, "It's sliding." "Then we stop," I said. We stopped, midstream, a dangerous place to stop. But stopping is better than snapping. We hauled the raft back to our bank. We tightened the wrap. We added another layer of leather. We rubbed more tallow. I wrote a note with time on a scrap and pinned it where everyone could see. "Rewrap at midday. Do not load more than 2 sacks." Because paper speaks when voices get loud. By afternoon, the ferry ran again, slow, careful. 2 sacks at a time, sometimes 1 if the current surged. People began to learn that the river did not care who they were. It only cared what weight they put on it. Near sundown, the air turned colder again. An ice storm came in soft, coating branches, making them shine. The world looked pretty and treacherous. Roy's breath puffed white, while his cheeks were chapped. A woman from town brought him a knitted cap, plain wool. She held it out without meeting his eyes. Roy took it, awkward. He glanced at me. I nodded. "You say thank you," I murmured. He said, "Thank you." And his voice surprised him by sounding older. That night, after midnight, someone knocked at our cellar door. Not hard, just 2 taps. I opened it and saw the sheriff, hat off, rain and sleet melting in his hair. He looked different without the hat, more human, more tired. He said, "A man upriver's taken sick. Bad. Doc Harlan wants to get there. The road's cut. He needs to cross with his bag." I watched the river beyond him. It moved like a dark animal. I said. Doc can cross. One person. No wagon. No second man. The line won't take it. The sheriff nodded. He swallowed once, and then said something that mattered. I was wrong to make it about rules. He did not say sorry. Men like him rarely do. But the admission was close enough to truth to be useful. Before dawn, Doc Harlan crossed on our raft, bag strapped tight, his body kept low. Roy and I pulled him across, hands numb, breath steady. At first light, Doc waved once from the far bank and disappeared into trees. The river kept roaring, but a thin thread of purpose ran over it. By midday, the ferry was a rhythm. Not easy, not safe, but known. Roy began to count pulls under his breath, not loud, just enough to keep his hands steady. He started keeping his own proof details. He took a piece of charcoal and made marks on the pine's gouge edge, small notches to show depth. One notch each day, so we could see change without guessing. That afternoon, and a man named Callum Reese tried to push. He said, "Load more. We're losing time." He had a loud voice and a belly that showed he had not missed many meals. I said, "Time is cheaper than a snapped line." He scoffed. He stepped toward the raft with a third sack. Roy's hands tightened on the rope. His eyes flashed. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I picked up my ledger, opened it, and showed Callum the penciled entries. The ration note, the fray note, the load note with time. "See this?" I said. "This is what keeps your flour on the right side of the river, not your impatience." He stared, embarrassed to be argued with by paper. Then he backed away, muttering, "Social pressure does not always come as threats. Sometimes it comes as a man trying to make you doubt your own sense." I did not doubt, and I had lived too long for that luxury. Near 3 in the afternoon, the river surged again, a new rush from the mountains. The line dipped lower, and the raft began to drag against it. The next visible consequence, beat, came as a sound. A sharp twang, like a fiddle string pulled too tight. Roy jerked his hands back. A rawhide strand had snapped at a splice, not the main line, but enough to warn. I said, "Off." We pulled the raft in and got everyone back. People grumbled. Someone cursed. A child cried. I kept my voice calm. "Listen to the rope," I said. "It just spoke. It said stop." We spent the next hour repairing. Rawhide strips soaked, twisted, wrapped, knots tightened, hands aching. Roy sat with his tongue between his teeth, concentrating. He was learning patience as a craft. When we finished, and I wrote on a scrap and pinned it beside the earlier note, "Repair complete before sundown." Another proof detail. Time pinned to paper. Because time is what winter and spring steal first. By sundown, the ferry ran again. Doc Harlan returned at first light the following morning, face drawn. He had saved the sick man, he said, but the man would need days of warmth and rest. Warmth. Rest. Two things spring floods make hard. The river stayed high for more than a week. Flour sacks crossed. Salt crossed. A small crate of sewing needles crossed, and I watched women's eyes soften at the sight of them. Roy's cap got wet, and then dry, and then wet again, until it smelled like river and smoke. He did not complain. One afternoon at midday, Ezra Pike crossed to our side and handed me a small bundle. Inside was a strip of iron, curved a saw, and a worn piece from an old barrel hoop. He said, "For your tree. To guard the rope." He looked away as he spoke, as if kindness embarrassed him. I took it. I said, "Thank you." 2 words. Plain. We nailed the iron strip to the pine where the gouge had grown. A crude guard. The rope slid against iron instead of bark, and the saw of it softened. Roy touched the iron after, eyes bright. "It'll last longer," he said. "It will," I agreed. And that's what help looks like. Not speeches. A scrap of iron offered at the right moment. By late afternoon, the river began to lower, slow as breath leaving a body. Not sudden, not dramatic, just steady retreat. The mud line on rocks showed. The willows stopped shaking so hard. The next consequence beat was quieter. People stopped shouting. They began to talk instead. H. Baker came again, not in anger this time, but with a small sack. He held it out. "Sugar," he said. "Not much." "For the boy?" Roy stared, wary. I stared too, because gifts from men like Baker usually have hooks. Baker cleared his throat. "I misjudged." He still could not say sorry, but he looked at the ferry line and the worn pine and the muddy bank, and he could not deny what he had used. I took the sack. I said, "We'll remember who helped." And I let that be the hook, because the town would remember too. Before dawn one morning, the sound of hammering came from downriver. Men were setting new posts for a temporary bridge upriver, where the bank was higher. The county had finally decided to spend effort, because now the river had shamed them in front of everyone. By first light, Roy and I walked down to the pine and looked at the gouge. and it was deep enough to hold a finger. The iron strip had kept it from widening further, but the mark remained. Roy asked, "Will it heal?" "A tree grows around wounds," I said. "It doesn't erase them. It carries them. So does a town." That day, we made our last crossings under heavy need. Medicine, a few sacks, a message from Doc Harlan's wife thanking us for the night we pulled him over in sleet. I put the letter in the ledger, tucked between pages, another proof detail that could be shown. Paper kept because paper mattered. Near midday, the river lowered enough that the far bank gravel bar widened. The current eased a shade. Roy sat on the raft, legs dangling, and watched the water. He looked older than he had in early April. He said, "They begged you." He said it with wonder, like he had seen a thing turn inside out. They begged the river first," I said. "They just didn't know it. And then they begged whoever had answered it." By late afternoon, the new temporary bridge upriver opened for foot traffic. Men walked across, cautious, carrying sacks on their backs. It held. People gathered on both sides and looked down at our line, still strung across, still humming faint in the wind. Someone called, "Thank you, Tamsin." A woman's voice, then another, then a child's small shout. Roy's eyes filled. He blinked hard, embarrassed. I reached and squeezed his shoulder once. Not a speech, a touch. That evening, before sundown, we untied the raft and dragged it up onto the bank. We coiled the rope and left it on the pine because it had earned rest. I wrote the last entry in the ledger for that season. April 18, ferry closed, a bridge upriver open. Pine gouge measures 2 fingers deep. Roy pulled true. Roy watched me write. Then he took the pencil and added his own small line beneath. "Thank you, river, for not taking us." He paused. Then he scratched it out, embarrassed. I did not mention it. Some things are better left as private practice. We moved back into the cabin that night. The floor had dried. The stove drew better. The air smelled of cedar and old smoke again. Roy ate a spoonful of sugar, slow, like he was tasting something rare. He smiled, small, then tried to hide it. I said, "You earned that." He looked at me, and this time he let the smile stay. In the weeks after, people in Cedar Ford stopped laughing so quick at women who built. Not all of them, not every day, but enough that it mattered. Ezra Pike nodded at me in town like I was a neighbor, not a curiosity. The sheriff stopped talking about rules when the river was involved and started talking about preparation. Doc Harlan kept a coil of rope in his wagon. and he told people it was not for heroics. It was for survival. Roy and I walked past the pine. Sometimes we touched the iron strip. We traced the gouge. We measured it with our eyes and remembered the pull of the rope in our hands. A wound in a tree, a line over water. A boy learning that steady work can keep people alive, even when the loudest voices say it cannot. If you want more calm, grounded frontier stories like this, subscribe and stay with us.